On this episode of Tim's Enthusiast Garage, we look at my roadside find, the Nissan 300ZX. It's a Z31 model car, normally aspirated V6. Not the kind of car I would typically buy. However, this car and cars just like it have a hidden superpower. They're able to transport you directly to 1986.
Totally edgy, futuristic, and radical styling.
Totally tubular.
T-top. Take off that hat, put on your driving specs, and get ready for the 1980s ride of your life. Throw a cassette in the cassette player and let that wow and flutter transport you to a time when things were totally awesome to the max.
Okay. If you've been watching the channel, you probably know an automatic, normally aspirated Nissan is probably not my idea of performance car of my lifetime. However, this roadside find is a lot more fun than I would have anticipated, and I think there's a great lesson in collectability here.
For those of us who are part of the self-proclaimed Gran Turismo generation, I would say the Z32 was probably the car we were more in love with of the two, the Z31 and the Z32. This episode is about the Z31, and even more so, it's about the opportunity to buy these cars now and own a classic car for the next few decades as they increase in value. I think it's a great opportunity, and it's something I don't talk enough about on the channel. I bought this car not because I was in love with the Z31, but because it was a great deal. This 300ZX is a 1986. 1986 is a one-year-only model where the side skirts and body molding are painted body color, but it retains the rear lights from the earlier car. 87 to 89 cars had a single bar light in the back, and also were the first cars to have LED third brake lights. Pretty cool. When buying cars from this era, it's really important to check out all the pieces because a lot of the parts aren't available, and on this car, a lot of the pieces are very vulnerable plastic bits, so it's a good idea to go over the whole car. One other item that's a very vulnerable spot on cars from this era are polished face wheels. A lot of cars have them from this era, and this car is no exception. You can see that the face of the wheel is polished, and it's extremely vulnerable to things like road salt and debris getting under that clear coat and making it look pretty tarnished. The Z31 300ZX was a little bit of a departure for Nissan. They left behind the inline 6 of the 280ZX, which was a great seller for them. With the Z31 300ZX, they introduced the first V6. In this car's case, a single overhead cam 3-liter normally aspirated engine, or you could get a 3-liter turbocharged engine. Nissan really went to town with the redesign of this car. It had a really low drag coefficient, and they really thought about everything when they were building this car. It was a total revamp. So much of a revamp that actually when they launched the car it was a Datsun. By the end of its run it was a Nissan. This car was called the Fairlady Z in Japan and the 300ZX here in the States.
The Z31 was available in both long and short wheelbase, 2+2 and 4-seat versions. The 2+2 is notable by the fact that the door butts right up to that rear wheel well.
A lot of what makes the Z31 300ZX really great is this T-top. And you can see it's equipped with these cool shades, and these shades can be removed. So you can have the sky there, sort of like with the sunroof, or block it out, just like you're in a coupe with a hardtop. I have to say, a lot of the details on this car really catch my eye now that didn't when the car was new. This being a 1986 car is badged only as a Nissan. They had dropped Datsun by this time. The car is surprisingly curvaceous, catches light in all the right ways, and of course the interior is filled with lots of Japanese intricacies.
These velour seats are fantastically sculpted, and they're beautiful.
Tons of adjustment, and I wish more seats had this headrest adjustment. Fore and aft adjustment like this is fantastic. State-of-the-art leading tech is where Japanese cars from this era excel. Despite this car having analog gauges, you could spec out one of these cars with the most spectacular digital cluster of all time.
They even equipped these cars with a little voice that would tell you if you had left the key in the ignition or if the door was open, if the lights were on. That was kind of cool. A lot of cars did gimmicky things like that in the 80s. It's one of those things that kind of makes these cars really charming now.
Lights are on. Lights are on.
And what 80s nostalgia trip is complete without pop-up headlights? And the Nissan Fairlady 300ZX has some nice pop-up headlights. Under the hood, it's typical 80s madness. Vacuum lines and sensors everywhere. It looks like a mess under here because it is kind of a mess under here. Now, these cars aren't particularly unreliable as compared with other cars from the era, but it's certainly something to think about. They're fairly complex.
Back in the day, I worked with a guy that had a Z31, and he was always envious of the German cars that I drove, the Porsches, the BMWs, the Volkswagens. And I'll be honest, I never for a second envied the Z31. I had driven a couple, and I wasn't crazy about them. Then this came up really inexpensively on the side of the road. I saw it, and it was one of those things where these are getting so old now that there really aren't any. There really are very, very few that are in collectible condition, that are like worthy of buying and holding on to. And so I made a crazy lowball offer, and I ended up with the one car that I really never, ever intended to buy. A Z31 300ZX, normally aspirated, automatic. However, therein lies something that I had missed all these years, is that cars from this era, just like this, automatic, have a really tall final gear or overdrive gear. They're great cruisers. It's great on the highway. This thing cruises, as you can hear, pretty quietly, even with the roof open. And there's something magical about this T-top thing. If you've ever driven anything that has T-tops, you don't lose as much chassis rigidity as you do on a true Targa. So you kind of get this beam that goes down the center, yet everything's still open. It's a very airy sense to the cabin. And like I've said earlier about other 80s cars, is that you get this really nice, I mean, the sun is right here. Sunroofs are now moved so far back for safety that these 80s cars really kind of have an air about them that you don't get with any of the more modern cars. If there's a moral to this episode, the moral to the episode is now's the time to be trolling those sort of roadside finds. If you go on a nice country drive in a small town, there's a good chance you're going to find a C4 Corvette or a C5 Corvette or a Z31, Z32 in a small town where maybe they're having a hard time selling it. It's an opportunity to buy a car for very low outlay that you can keep around if you have a nice place to store them. These cars are only going to go up in value. So in this time of I don't know, confusing times where it's really hard to know where to invest your money, as enthusiasts, we've grown up with a variety of cars. We sort of know values of cars as they come out. We see how they depreciate. And now here we are with these cars. We have the opportunity to really know a great deal when it presents itself to us. And so it's one of those opportunities where right now, the Z31 may not be your dream car, but throw in your favorite 80s band on the tape deck and just rolling. You know, it's one of those things where, you know, Ethan, who I've had on the program before, drove this car last year after one of his soccer games, and he loved it. And I think there's something to it. It's a classic in the modern sense. Cars like this, where you can buy them very inexpensively, you know, to drive them just to keep them sort of alive, can really be a recreational, fun activity. I mean, hopping in this car, popping the T-top off, putting some jams on the radio, is a very transportive sort of experience that you're not going to get in a modern car, and you're making money while you wait for the right person to come along. Automatic transmissions from this era were pretty well built. However, if they've never had a transmission fluid change, you know, a lot of transmissions from this era kind of were lifetime fluid transmissions, and no transmission is a lifetime fluid. So you are going to want to check that. Z31s in particular rot like crazy. So the whole rear suspension area, the rear fender wells, if it's a Z31 turbo that has like the fender flare covers on it, you're going to actually want to look under those fender flare covers, that plastic body kit, and make sure there's metal there, because whatever the steel was that they used on these cars, they do have a tendency to rust, and so that's something to consider. Other things to look out for, the 3-liter engine in this car is a pretty robust engine. If you look on forums, the turbos and the normally aspirated cars can have low oil pressure issues. I have been very lucky in that any Nissan I've ever bought has not had those issues. In talking with some of the people online and some of the people that are really passionate about these cars, I guess it is kind of less common, and sort of preventative maintenance prevents those sorts of things. But that's another thing to look out for. Really, if this episode's about anything, it's about buying a car from the 80s, really 70s, 80s, 90s. One of those cars that really hasn't hit its stride yet. And right now that's cars from the mid-80s to mid-90s. There's a lot of cars to be had there. So whether you're into Japanese or you're into American or whatever it is that you're into, there's a ton of stuff out there where it's still cheap. And you can grab those cars and they're going up. You know, I've watched this car over the past couple years that I've owned it just creep up in value and creep up in value. And part of that is due to the fact that, as I said, there just aren't any. If this was your first car and you wanted to get your first car, there aren't a lot of options out there where you can buy that car, have that experience cheaply and easily. You know, again, as I said, C4 Corvette, obviously. You know, I think I may have actually missed the ZR1s. Those are kind of starting to get expensive. I absolutely love the first year ZR1. I think that's a car to watch. All the GM stuff, the Firebirds, the Trans Ams. There's a variety of things that you can buy really right and still make a good profit on. Lastly, on cars from this era, there's a lot of plastic parts. You know, whereas in 60s and 70s cars there was a lot of metal products, in this car almost everything's plastic. So as I showed you with the dash, you know, the dashes have a tendency to shrink and pull away. That's an issue. One thing to be aware of is part scarcity. A lot of these cars, you aren't going to just hop on eBay and find a replacement part for it. There's certain parts for my Scirocco and certain parts for cars of this era that, like a seal up here, that if you can't find it, may be a little harder to get than you anticipate. So when you're looking to buy one of these cars, either as a flip or as a long-term investment, or just as a car that you've always loved and you want to enjoy, and it's a good investment long-term, a car you can give sort of a heirloom to your children one day, it is a good idea to buy the best example you can find. I mean, when it comes to the Z31, I bought this car because it was the best example of anything I had ever seen. When I bought my Citroen CX, it was just the only Citroen I had ever seen. But it's also kind of given me pause on really keeping that car, because it's something where there's so many little odds and ends. I don't know if it makes sense to keep it.
So in conclusion, I would say finding a car from this era at the rock bottom of its depreciation curve makes pretty good sense. And I would encourage you to find one. Hold on to it, and maybe it's something you never sell. Maybe it becomes an heirloom. But maybe you find out you've got a knack for this and you can flip these cars over and over and over again until you have a pretty tasty garage of your own.
As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.